My Family's Messianic Experience, 1995 to 2022, Part 2 of 3. 2000 to 2002, the University of Oklahoma. I started at the University of Oklahoma in fall 1999, and I chose political science as my major and history as my minor. I continued to have my website, TNN Online, although it was clear enough that I was starting to address fewer matters involving prophecy and the end times, and more matters involving theology and messianic practice. As I became integrated into college life, I tried out a number of on-campus ministries where my friends attended, including the Baptist Student Union, Campus Crusade for Christ, and Chi Alpha. My college studies and academic pursuits began to impact the level of my Bible studies and writing articles. By this time, though, I was not worried about the year 2000 and Y2K. The Lord had shown our family through the Honduras experience that He was able to protect us through difficulty. Simultaneously occurring to my going to college, the Messianic movement was entering into a new phase of development, whether it liked it or not. Waves of non-Jewish believers had entered into Messianic congregations in the late 1990s, by this time outnumbering Jewish believers in various places. Messianic Judaism, reflecting much of the Jewish community, has been pluralistic on many theological matters. At the turn of the millennium, one noticeable shift was a sector within Messianic Judaism, which believed that the movement could one day be recognized as a formal branch of Judaism alongside the Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, etc. branches. This was not embraced by the significant majority of Messianic Judaism, which saw the movement more as an organic move of the Holy Spirit, but it has affected a sizable part of Messianic Jewish theological development. It was clear enough that Messianic Judaism was going to enter into a post-missionary phase where it had to think beyond simply Jewish outreach and evangelism. With non-Jewish believers entering into the Messianic community in greater numbers, there were a number of responses on how to proceed forward. Some Messianic Jewish congregations, greatly, discouraged non-Jewish participation. Still, various Messianic Jewish congregations did embrace non-Jewish believers who were called into the Messianic movement as fellow brothers and sisters and together as representatives of the one new humanity. Ephesians 2:15, New Revised Standard, Complete Jewish Bible. Still, though, a wide number of non-Jewish believers, being led by the Lord to embrace their faith heritage in Israel's scriptures, in particular, the appointed times or biblical feasts, can say that they did not fully find themselves treated as equals of the Jewish believers in Messianic Jewish settings. Galatians 3:28. A number of these non-Jewish believers, not fully feeling welcome in Messianic Judaism, either returned to their previous church settings or entered into a number of the new sub-movements that spun off of Messianic Judaism by the early 2000s. Answers were being sought in the early 2000s for why so many non-Jewish believers were being drawn into the Messianic movement. By far, the most provocative answer, which began being promoted en masse in the late 1990s, was seen via the emergence of the two-house sub-movement. The two-house sub-movement widely postulated that the reason why so many non-Jewish believers swelled the Messianic community was because they were members of the 10 lost tribes, Ephraim, and are being reunited with the Jewish people, Judah, in fulfillment of prophecies such as Ezekiel 37:15 through 28. 1998 saw the release of the book, Who is Israel and Why You Need to Know by Batya Wooten, including a full-page advertisement in the Messianic Times. The International Messianic Jewish Alliance responded in 1999 with the issuance of the Ephraimite Error White Paper, which did not focus so much on resolving the questions of the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel in biblical history and prophecy, as much as it did focus on some of the shoddy interpretations and bad behavior of various two-house supporters, particularly Moshe Koniuszowski, who had a major sacred name-only agenda. Early two-house conferences, 1999 to 2002, while not uniformly sacred name-only, did see an affluent use of the divine name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, typically Yahweh or Yahweh. Far from wanting to facilitate some degree of unity with individual Messianic Jewish believers, at least, the two-house sub-movement became riddled with a great deal of anti-Jewish and anti-Christian sentiment. Far from wanting to see a greater degree of unity between both houses of Israel, as they would say, the two-house sub-movement widely did more to divide and condemn Jews and Christians and their so-called paganism and traditions of men, to say nothing of its wide-scale dismissal of responsible biblical scholarship and exegesis. A far less provocative answer to the non-Jewish question, but also controversial, was seen in the early 2000s with the emergence of the One Law or One Torah sub-movement, originally spearheaded by the popular ministry First Fruits of Zion, but especially via the theology and teachings of Tim Hegg of Torah Resource. The original premise of One Law theology was seen in their approach to a statement such as, "There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you." Exodus 12:49, English Standard Version. The implication was that God's Torah is universal instruction to all of his people, regardless of whether or not a person was Jewish or non-Jewish. Non-Jewish believers in the Messianic movement were to be likened unto the sojourners or gerim in ancient Israel, with the frequent conclusion drawn that there were no differences or distinctions of any kind between native and sojourner. A number of the early materials reflective of One Law and published by First Fruits of Zion included Torah Rediscovered, 1996, and Take Hold, 1998, by Ariel and Devorah Berkowitz, and later, The Letter Writer, Paul's Background and Torah Perspective, 2002, by Hegg. Another influential book would be The Mystery of the Gospel, Jew and Gentile in the Eternal Purpose of God, 2003, by D. Thomas Lancaster. To its credit, some of these materials and teachers genuinely wanted to engage in biblical scholarship, exegesis, and they certainly had a more positive than negative disposition toward the synagogue and church. Many non-Jewish believers in the Messianic movement joined into First Fruits of Zion's Torah Club program, and their materials were even seen in various parts of Messianic Judaism. Yet, various Messianic Jewish leaders were seen in the early 2000s to come out against a one-law theology. It would have been very difficult if you were a non-Jewish believer in the sphere of influence of things Messianic, not to have encountered teachings and teachers who did not identify as either two-house or one law in the early 2000s. Many of us were affected by a number of these ideas. While approached negatively by much of Messianic Judaism, even today in 2022, neither two house nor one law are identical. In late spring 2000, my family's time in Norman, Oklahoma came to a conclusion, as my stepfather, Mark Huey, moved on to another consulting position, this time with a ministry in Kissimmee, Florida. This would involve networking with many of the non-Jewish believers and independent fellowships, influenced by various two-house and/or one-law ideas, which did not find themselves too welcomed within Messianic Judaism. I continued attending the University of Oklahoma, only spending the summers of 2000, 2001, and 2002 in Central Florida. During this time, while working toward my bachelor's degree, I kept up the TNN Online website, now composed of 3 sub-websites: Tribulation News Network, Theology News Network, and Two House News Network. I admit I took it upon myself to see that all of the controversial issues which I thought were unnecessarily dividing us could be addressed out in the open and taken care of. This was the time period that the main material for my 2 earliest books, When Will the Messiah Return? And The New Testament Validates Torah, formerly The New Covenant Validates Torah, was written. Today in 2022, I have come a long way in my theology and approach to the issues I encountered in 2002. I might have made some different choices if the Messianic environment of the early 2000s had not been so polarized. Still, it was far better for me to come to some incomplete or underdeveloped theological conclusions in my college days than be drunk or promiscuous or addicted to drugs, as many in college frequently are. 2003 to 2004. Outreach Israel Ministries. Like the experience of many young people, I think if I could, there would be a number of things that I would go back in time and correct from my college experience. During my university years of 1999 to 2003, I did my best as a Messianic person to fellowship with various on-campus Christian ministries. My roommate, my junior year, 2001-2002, was even the son of a pastor. I focused on issues of common faith in the Lord first, and was not hard and heavy about some of my Messianic convictions, typically only offering a Messianic perspective as one of enrichment or a deeper understanding. The fact that I had my own theology website, however, did occupy a great deal of my free time. I did not socialize with others like I could have. Looking back on things, I had the experience in college that I needed to have, as I was working through a great number of issues. It was far better that I worked through some of these issues within the privacy of my dorm room than out in a public ministry venue. In September 2002, the ministry consulting position, which my stepfather, Mark Huey, had in Kissimmee, Florida, came to a close. Over a number of months, my parents were seeking the direction of the Lord regarding what to do. It was becoming clear enough to them, especially with me finishing my undergraduate degree and some of the books that I had been producing, that we were being prepared as a family to start our own ministry. Outreach Israel Ministries was officially launched in November 2002, with an original focus on the people and the land of Israel. While at this point, the pendulum had shifted away from Messianic Judaism toward more independent Messianic expressions, we definitely felt the need to be veered back toward building bridges, if possible, with open-minded and welcoming people in the Messianic Jewish community. I graduated from the University of Oklahoma in May 2003 and relocated to Central Florida. Very soon, Outreach Israel Ministries and TNN Online would start producing an array of educational materials, as our family anticipated that the Messianic perspective was about to blow open. One of the things I had, being a new university graduate, was a college degree. Far too many of the leaders and teachers who one will encounter across some parts of the Messianic spectrum are not adequately trained. But more important than that, we wanted to be able to produce materials which could help people like us from evangelical backgrounds avoid some of the pitfalls and mistakes which we had made. Some of the early publications we released in 2003 and 2004 included Torah in the Balance, Volume 1, Hebraic Roots, an Introductory Study, now Messianic Beginnings, an Introductory Study, The Dangers of Pre-Tribulationism, Messianic Winter Holiday Helper, Messianic Spring Holiday Helper, Messianic Fall Holiday Helper, Messianic Sabbath Helper, and Torahscope Volume 1. And yes, this would later be followed in early 2005 with Introduction to Things Messianic. Other potential projects had open files. Some of these projects reached various stages of completion, others did not materialize. Mark Huey began 2004 with the intention of seeing Outreach Israel Ministries grow, which for him meant that we had to interact in person with various speaking trips to different congregations and small groups. I had to learn how to balance some of the early research and writing of our new ministry with our travel schedule. We went on a number of multi-week excursions, driving from Florida to the Midwest several times, flying out to Western Canada, flying out to the West Coast, hosting a tour to Israel, being invited for 10 days to the United Kingdom, and driving in a Southwest-Southeastern tour. Our ministry certainly met and networked with many people. For me, it was an opportunity to see new parts of North America and the world. But most importantly, we got a hands-on feel for some of the difficulties and controversies which were coming, seeing them in their infancy. These included not only some of the problems originating from sacred name onlyism, two-house and Israelite identity, but also the various so-called restored biblical calendar systems, the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew and Matthew 23, and most especially those who would recognize Yeshua as Messiah, but not as God. And yes, we would also encounter those who would place a lifestyle of Torah before their presumed faith in Yeshua. The traveling throughout 2004 was not easy for either Mark Huey or myself, but we had to do it. While one would think that in interacting with new and idealistic Messianic people, that they would want to see the love of Yeshua and a desire to live like him be the major motivating force for their actions. We encountered this far less often than we should have. We encountered far more people with a drive for the so-called truth, with a capital T. Far too many non-Jewish people who place some elusive identity as members of scattered Ephraim as more important than Messiah faith. And a majority who had major problems with some of the legitimate contributions of evangelical Christianity. It was not easy going from place to place, knowing that you were most probably going to encounter that each group had its own particular issue of dominance, which was hardly consistent with the original Messianic Jewish mission of Jewish evangelism, outreach, and support for the state of Israel. Our new family ministry tried many things in 2002 to 2004, our first 2 years, and we learned a great deal as well. We did make a few mistakes along the way. I honestly wondered at the end of 2004 if I had been truly called by the Lord into this, and I had no idea about the kinds of changes which I would be going through as 2005 began. (2005 to 2008), Asbury Theological Seminary. For the first decade or so, throughout our early Messianic experience, our family had certainly encountered our fair share of problematic and false teachings. We had also been subjected to various underwhelming levels of theological engagement. This was not limited to either parts of Messianic Judaism or the more independent persuasions we were involved with in the early days of Outreach Israel Ministries. The one common thread throughout some of these challenges was that very few leaders and teachers had any formal theological training from either a Bible college or seminary. In fact, a number of people went out of their way to especially attack anyone who went to cemetery. Yet, these were some of the same people who had done no real study in Hebrew or Greek, their engagement almost entirely limited to Strong's Concordance, and they certainly would not know how to engage with the proposals of contemporary Bible scholarship, accessing technical commentaries and studies. Traveling throughout 2004 was good, in that it gave us an in-person idea about the sorts of matters we would have to confront, even if it were just bad attitudes. Our family was not going to stay in full-time ministry unless one of us received some formal theological training, and with it a certain ability to not fall into the traps which we saw traveling the circuit. There is no doubt in my mind why my family had to spend time in Central Florida, the satellite campus of Asbury Theological Seminary. In summer 2004, I had submitted my application and was accepted to begin my master's degree at Asbury for winter 2005. It was a good thing that Asbury had a campus in Orlando, because if I had moved to Wilmore, Kentucky, given my family's deep Methodist heritage, I may not be writing this, and I would have left things Messianic. Instead, I went to Asbury, Orlando, a different place, with no significant family memories. I went to seminary with a specific goal: to learn the necessary skills to be able to be theologically engaged. We had encountered far too many people in our 9-year Messianic experience, to this point, who could not do this. Many, upon hearing that I was going to seminary, certainly did not respond well. Why do you need to do that? Are you going to learn anything that you have not already learned? And indeed, throughout my coursework toward my degree in biblical studies, I had numerous occasions, I believe, to separate from the Messianic movement and return to evangelicalism. One of the things I quickly learned at Asbury, as I started classes for the spring 2005 semester, is how much I had been influenced by fundamentalism for the previous 9 to 10 years of my spiritual life, a direct consequence of being a part of the Messianic movement. It did not matter whether it was Messianic Judaism or interacting with those who identified as some other independent expression. One of my first Asbury professors identified as holding to extreme minimalism, the belief that almost everything in the Tanakh, Old Testament, up to the so-called return of the Jewish exiles from Babylon, was largely assembled as a myth, so that the Persian Empire would fund their relocation to the Holy Land in order to build a better life. Hearing this would be the point where most Messianics I know would leave. It is also an extreme example, but if you want to be in full-time ministry, you cannot limit yourself to only hearing the voices you want to listen to. More often than not, as I was first taking classes in 2005, I was being exposed to conservative opinions about the Tanakh and its historicity that even today in 2022 would not be too welcome in some sectors of the Messianic community. I got along with the vast majority of my fellow students at Asbury because I did not go to seminary with the intention of trying to convert my fellow students to some of my different Messianic beliefs. Many of my fellow students at Asbury Orlando had to commute between 2 to 3 hours from all over Florida and Georgia. In the different breaks between classes, they hardly ever wanted to discuss theology. Most wanted to instead seek solace from their fellow students in ministry over the various difficulties they were facing as pastors. So, by the grace of God, I never really got involved in any theological debates over Messianic minutiae. The independent Messianic community, as it was perhaps best considered then, went through a number of significant controversies from 2005 to 2008, the same time as I was at Asbury. During summer and into fall 2005, Monty Judah of Lion and Lamb Ministries issued a series of teachings dismissing the Epistle to the Hebrews as legitimate Holy Scripture. One of his major claims against Hebrews was that various Tanakh quotations, i.e., Jeremiah 31, 31-34, and Hebrews 8, 8-12, did not align with what was seen in the Hebrew. To be certain, anyone who would have possessed a minimum amount of formal biblical training would have been able to easily answer this. The author of Hebrews frequently does not quote from the Hebrew Tanakh, but instead the Greek Septuagint translation. This was the first major test for me at Asbury. Would I stay in a Messianic movement where these kinds of errors would be present? Would I stay in a Messianic movement that gave a high regard for Hebrew, but often demonstrated an ungodly prejudice toward Greek? How did our ministry respond to the Hebrews fiasco of 2005? We used this as an opportunity to assert ourselves as an up-and-coming educational ministry. I did a Bible study on Hebrews as part of a new recorded Wednesday night Bible study before podcasts. I would use the material, when completed, to produce a volume in our new For the Practical Messianic series. These would be technical studies, but not overly so, as we would also reflect upon the condition of the emerging Messianic movement and ask difficult questions regarding what the Lord wanted us to emerge into. Throughout 2005 to 2016, our ministry released a wide selection of these commentaries, including, in order, James, Hebrews, Philippians, Galatians, Apostolic Scriptures Survey, Tanakh Survey, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, Acts 15, the Pastoral Epistles, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. A much bigger test for our family's long-term involvement in Messianic things, but most especially regarding what we were going to do with the whole two-house issue, came in early summer 2008. In late spring 2008, avid two-house proponent Moshe Koniuchowski released his book, Sex and the Believer, Shocking Freedom of Sexuality in Torah, which unashamedly embraced and endorsed the practice of polygamy, men having multiple wives. At this time, our ministry had maintained an elusive approach to the specifics of the issue of two-house. We acknowledged that there were unfulfilled prophecies like Ezekiel 37, 15-28, that the restoration of Israel's kingdom was bigger than just today's Jewish people, and speculated that some non-Jewish believers might be members of the scattered northern kingdom, but ultimately known only to God. Polygamy in our minds, and certainly in the minds of many others, was not only an aberration introduced by the fall, but King Solomon's polygamy was a direct cause of ancient Israel's split into the two kingdoms. The two-house sub-movement could have used the issue of polygamy as a means to recognize the errors and sins of ancient Israel, not to be repeated. Instead, most leaders decided to remain quiet. Many, due to the patriarchal nature of many of its leaders, would instead be seen emphasizing that without the 2 wives and 2 concubines of Jacob, there would have been no 12 tribes. For our family, this triggered a significant difference in values between 2-house patriarchy and the egalitarianism we believed instead needed to come forth among all Messianics. The failure for various 2-house leaders in 2008 to forthrightly condemn teachings endorsing polygamy led me especially to start steadily pulling away from anything having to do with the label 2-house, save the relevant prophecies which speak of the reunion of the northern and southern kingdoms. 2009 to 2012. The transition. My time at Asbury Theological Seminary from 2005 to 2008 was much different and much better than my time at the University of Oklahoma from 1999 to 2003. I was definitely able to reconnect to my evangelical and Wesleyan heritage in a substantial way, and it really started to come through in my ministry. When I graduated, I received the Zondervan Biblical Languages Award for Greek, no less. But when graduation was all over, there was a nagging question. What is our ministry going to do now? The fact was that our family was loosely associated with various independent Messianic people, not necessarily 2-house or strident 1 law, but not necessarily Messianic Jewish either. What was our future going to be? Continue to write books? In 2009, social media tools such as Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube were still relatively new. Smartphones were also just coming onto the market, and anyone in the United States in 2008 was confronted with the words change and hope because of the election of Barack Obama. If I had not attended seminary when I did, between 2005 to 2008, I may not have attended at all because of the 2008 financial crisis. Immediately after my graduation, in spring 2009, our family started asking questions about what was next. Within the next school year, my youngest sister Maggie would be graduating from high school. Were we going to spend the rest of our lives in Central Florida? One of our thoughts was to relocate northward up near Jacksonville, as we had extended family and my grandmother in the area. We began putting out prayers as well as feelers. Yet during summer 2009, my mother, Maggie, and I all went on a road trip, which began to change our trajectory completely. Initially, Maggie believed that just like her sister Jane, 2001 to 2005, she would attend Vanderbilt University. Due to her high academics and athletics at high school, she was also very interested in the Naval ROTC program. Yet in 2009, Vanderbilt had become much more difficult to enter. My mother knew that Maggie needed to also visit the other family school, the University of Oklahoma. So the 3 of us took a trip in mid-July 2009 to Norman, Oklahoma. I had not been back since my graduation, so I was very happy to reconnect. But I absolutely remember what happened as all 3 of us walked into the armory where both the Army and Navy ROTC had their units. We were all hit with supernatural knowledge just by that military machine shop smell that Maggie was going to OU. She attended OU from 2010 to 2014, receiving both her bachelor's and master's degrees and meeting her husband, Taylor Willits. In late summer 2009, a huge theological development hit the Messianic world, as First Fruits of Zion made a shift in their theology away from 1 law to divine invitation. This was basically the belief that while Jewish people had a covenantal obligation or requirement to keep matters of Torah such as the Sabbath, appointed times, and dietary laws, non-Jewish believers in Israel's Messiah had no expectation to do these things, but could be regarded as invited by God to do them if they were so led. Easily, For the next several years, 2009 to 2011, people across the board were scrambling over what to do and how to respond to this. Tim Hegg of Torah Resource, who did not join with First Fruits of Zion in this change, issued a strong rebuttal. All of a sudden, First Fruits of Zion teachers could be seen attending what were considered to be mainstream Messianic Jewish events and conferences. And if you were not Jewish, but in some kind of Messianic ministry, you were definitely being asked about where you stood regarding non-Jewish believers and Torah. As we have done with so many polarizing issues, our ministry decided to take a third, alternative approach, rooted in the prophetic expectations of Micah 4, 1 through 3, and Isaiah 2, 2 through 4, and the new covenant of Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34, and Ezekiel 36, 25 to 27. Supernatural compulsion. God writes God's commandments on the hearts of God's people at the pace of God's Holy Spirit, dependent upon the willingness of a man or woman to grow and mature in faith. Salvation history has progressed toward the era of New Covenant. The 2009 change on the part of First Fruits of Zion was partially responsible for the 2013 release of our ministry's Messianic Torah Helper. Throughout fall 2009 and well into summer 2010, I knew that my seminary training would have to be reflected in our ministry publications. So I began a steady process of editing, updating, and expanding our resources. At the time, only a handful of our ministry books were in paperback, with the majority still only available in spiral-bound comb. I knew that in the future, if we were going to see all of our books in paperback, they would have to be substantially updated. I had learned a great deal in seminary, which now needed to be integrated into our materials. I had no idea what the Lord was readying us for. In 2005, my maternal grandmother, Mary Ruth Jeffries, now deceased, 2019, had moved down from Annapolis, Maryland to a retirement center in Orange Park, Florida, adjacent to my aunt and her family. We would visit Grandmother Jeffries every few weeks. She started out with a rather large apartment, and then sized down to a one-bedroom apartment, and then later to memory care. In 2010, during her third move, which we went up to help, my mother and I both had the same experience. As we were leaving the complex to go have lunch, the Lord gave us the same word. I would much rather move back to Dallas. We were counting on one day, moving up to the Jacksonville area. But here, we were both thinking about moving back to Texas. Not coincidental by any means. Mark Huey was in Dallas that weekend visiting with family and friends. He was absolutely elated when we told him. But the pull westward had already started in 2009, on the trip with my sister Maggie to the University of Oklahoma. The process of moving back to Texas would not take place instantly. My sister Jane was presently without employment and had moved from her job in Nashville to live with us in Kissimmee. The DFW Metroplex, however, has always had a dynamic economy. By the late fall 2010, my sister Jane had moved back to Dallas, and my stepfather Mark would share an apartment with her and travel back to Orlando for however long the transition period took to relocate our entire family and ministry. I spent most of 2011 continuing to update our ministry publications, particularly with the knowledge that in relocating back to North Texas, we would be associating in some way with a large Messianic Jewish community. The TNN Online website contracted to Theology News Network. This was the time when the Lord showed me some important alternative approaches to Bible passages such as Galatians 5, 2 and 3, and 1 Corinthians 7, 17 to 24, in anticipation of encountering many who were beginning to avidly espouse bilateral ecclesiology. This was also the time when our ministry publication, Israel in Future Prophecy was being prepared, which would offer a fair resolution to the two-house controversy, thoroughly engaged with Jewish and Christian Bible scholarship, and not Lost Tribes fairy tales. Due to the real estate market in Central Florida, our family and ministry did not move back to North Texas until 2.5 years later in December 2012. It was a very long and arduous wait, but it was well worth it. The June 2023 issue of Outreach Israel News, Part 3 of 3, will cover our family's return to Dallas and McKinney, Texas, and reintegration into the Messianic Jewish community.